Hello everyone, today we talk about the military history of the Albigensian Crusade. In several years we never dedicated even a single video to probably the warfare of the Albigensian Crusade, meaning I have something here and there, especially on the Cathars. I talked about the beginning of the Albigensian Crusade in a standalone video. But for our campaign series, I think this is a very much more than due subject that we will try to dissect today. It's always going to be a general introduction to the matter, but as you understand, we are going to provide with a solid bedrock also for further more in-depth content. As you know, the Albigensian Crusade originated in the papal determination to eradicate Cathar dualism from Languedoc after prolonged unsuccessful preaching missions and diplomatic pressure had failed to secure effective action from the regional nobility. All right, you know what's the general political landscape. You know also what's the ambiguity regarding the idea of Catharism as far as a political instantiation was concerned. We should make more videos on Occitania to understand why, so regardless of the gaps that we have in the reconstruction of the Catholic Church, is the general political fragmentation of Occitania, the fact that the Counts of Toulouse in particular were sort of negotiating power from wrestling it from the local commune. The system had not evolved into a proper principality like in other parts of France and Europe. This was a decentralized area with significant infiltrations, pretty rich urban communities, pretty much connected also with the general East. All the history of Bogomilism and how this had reinfiltrated is what the old Gnostic Manichaean dualism, in fact, insinuating itself across the four testators and the third testators as well of the most developed parts of medieval Europe. There was plenty of Cathars in central and northern Italy, in the Rhineland, right? Or even in England. There isn't much of a geographical or political spread as much as a social one, right? Just last today, when you have, Marxists or Islamists at the fringes of Western society, right? You do have these anti-civilizational forces that operate in the shadows and try to subvert constituted order in many different ways. There is all a background of evangelical paparistic movements. There is a pretty solid chunk of what will eventually even side in this war with the Cathars. We're actually not Cathars, but we're in fact navigating the general political and social instantiation, especially in the light of the northern French expansion and recompaction of territories that had long escaped, in fact, royal rule in the far south, had always taken some sort of an antagonistic stance against that concept of order. So there was really a lot behind that, and fortunately I already made enough videos for you to find them in my videos about medieval France, Occitania, also the medieval heterodoxy and heresy playlist, etc. Cathar dualism, rooted in a radical interpretation of Christian cosmology that echoed earlier dualist currents such as Bogomilism, as we said, transmitted from the Balkans. At this point, the only creed that forced the Byzantines into an actual crusade, it was otherwise alien to their own culture, as you well know. They exterminated everybody, just like the papacy in France fortunately did in this instance. And they held the Cathars that the material world was creation, as you know, of an evil principle with a spiritual realm alone belonging to a good God, right? This is straightforward dualism, Gnosticism. These were old heresies that had already been there. And it wasn't even just for the means of the time to fundamentally eradicate. I mean, thought is not controllable, and even today, you can imagine at the time. Adherents known as perfects therefore rejected the sacraments, the cross, even literally as a symbol, because it was made of matter, literally. That's how far they went. And the authority of the Roman Church as instruments of the evil demiurge, right? And there would be further ideological implications and parallelisms we can draw from today, but I made pretty long and exhaustive videos about the Catholics, what I would, in other heresies, they were somehow very similar to one another. If you not just in agnosticism is a very wide, contains really a very wide array of ideologies. There are some deep, fundamental dichotomies within the Orthodox, the realm of Catholic orthodoxy and heretical and even heterodox movements, right? They all have to do with essentially a political and social instance that here it's not. We will make, again, lots of more videos. I know that I always say these things, like there is already something, but you can easily check that out. And if you have enough time, definitely you have more than that for sure to watch this content regarding these topics. Now, this dualist cosmology further rejected, as you understand, also the incarnation as a consequence, as impossible for a purely spiritual deity, and denied the resurrection of the body, which is possibly the worst aspect of this all, because, of course, the entire imperial Catholic traditional theology since pre-Christian times, in full line with all the pre-Christian Indo-European, in fact, Catholic doctrines, speak of incarnation and divine transfiguration, right? So this also goes the other way around. And as you know, it's actually something that in Saint Christianity is properly true. Theosis itself very much spread differently from also Judaism and Islam. By the way, the Cathars had particularly a predilection for Jews that they used as baileys, by the way. As you know, I don't engage into anti-Semitism, but for all those lesser people that think that, I don't know, the Catholic Church was this terrible Jewish psyop that sort of distracted Europe from a higher Indo-European values. Just know that the church was not just aligned with imperial power, but that the male church was not particularly tendered against the Jews, in spite of protecting them at the end of the day, but also like crushed a dualist sect that was, for some sort of strange reason, also offering this Jews this administrative posts. The Cathars insisted on a purely spiritual salvation achieved through successive reincarnations until the consolamentum ritual releasing the soul from material bondage, by the way, which is paradoxically a materialistic ideology, just like communism, right? Communism should be about eventual redistribution and same matter, because that's all that matters, right? But in an actually instantiated political critical sense, the point is not just that, of course, communists want to steal other people's goods and property in particular, but they feel threatened essentially by power per se and would like to destroy the world entirely together with all its matter, right? So if you are hysterically obsessed about people having wealth and you not having to engage with that, this went all the way to veganism, say forced chastity, and more, in terms of all the array of that we see also represented in today's far left, and not only, unfortunately, political spectrum, right? Because this is essentially just a lesser people's ideology, right? That was, in fact, lamenting itself. There is the consolamentum of the Cathars, for that matter, that the name is also quite interesting, towards a universal hierarchy, that in terms of temporal and spiritual authority, the kingdom of France doesn't matter that there is a whole Roman Empire, it's the regnum, right, and the papacy, the sacerdotium, respectively, were at this point blossoming, right, and that from a civilizational point of view is always the same, right? If you are the one who go down, you're the poor victim, right? That's the narrative. Instead, whoever wins and is more powerful and richer as a consequence, and also full continuity with biblical tradition, for that matter, in theology, as far as indeed also the pre-Christian ones as well. Those are terrible exploiters, right? This is exactly the same type of ideology that you see today, right, in Marxism, Islamism, and so on. The consolamentum itself was administered by the laying on of hands by a perfect, transferring the Holy Spirit and marking the recipient's definitive renunciation of the material world with a beautiful engagement. So with any also distraction and antithetical purpose of achieving divinity, among other things, by the way. You just have to let yourself go, right? You have to become a radically passive object, right? To just, dispel this terrible chain that somebody else has put on yourself, but that, in the sense, you do not seem to have another power in a victorious sense, because in their mind it's all a trap, right? The more you engage in earthly power, the more that's not you learn how to handle power and to do it to use it for doing good. It's just all matter. It's all entropy that can't be inverted. So this is completely opposite to all the major universal religions had historically existed in all the Orthodox, say in all their Orthodox core, by the way. An absolute hypocrisy and torturous lifestyle, right? The idea is that after the consolamentum, the newly consoled, in fact, literally consoled, you're a victim, right? We have to console you being a victim, was expected to live in absolute purity, which purity, quote unquote purity, meaning what? Essentially abstaining from meat, sexual relations, and all forms of material attachment to begin with, right? Which was not, again, seen as, in proper Catholic tradition, as maybe an ascetic training for achieving power that would manifest in the flesh on earth in the divinizing concept of the imperial Catholic monarch. It also made lots of videos on. No, this is, you literally have basically to die, right, to the point of dissolution properly in any material sense, so you can't go back to this purely spiritual thing that embraces you. An incredibly passive ideology, passivistic ideology. Bogomilism, that we mentioned, by the way, itself had emerged in the 10th century Bulgaria. Made a video about also the relation with Bulgarian rulers, which is somehow underappreciated. Much of the undermining of the first Bulgarian Empire came at the hands of Bogomils as well, in a social sense, and not dissimilarly from what was happening here in Occitania. I mean, an unprecedented level of power. Some people start, there were different sociocultural implications, but it was all a counter-civilizational mechanism as well. Bogomilism was called like this because it happened under the priest Bogomil and spread through Balkan trade and missionary networks into northern Italy and southern France, as we were saying before, by the 12th century. Carrying with it a hierarchical structure of perfectists we've seen in believers that closely paralleled later Cathar organization. Bogomil teaching had already provoked Byzantine imperial condemnation under Emperor Alexius I Comnenus, reigned 1081-1118. We know him very well, made lots of videos about him, who faced simultaneous threats from the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia and the Normans in particular in the west. His theologian, Euthemius Zygabenus, composed a detailed refutation that later informed Western heresiologists confronting the Southern French dualists as well. This is also very interesting and also stressing. Again, I don't want to digress on this subject, but I just received a message that was asking me for a Q&A. Why there are some people that are radically denying on the spectrum of historiographical consensus the fact that the Cathars even existed as some sort of broader association. This doesn't even matter in the sense that we lack the explicit document. It is completely normal if you look at 12th, 13th century society, right? What we know, by indication, by a wide plethora of sources, including across the Mediterranean, across Europe, is really very meaningful. We know that these cults existed to begin with, right? If you know their history, if you know how they had preserved themselves at some point, also through some texts that remerged later in modernity, you know that this was, again, a dichotomically universal heresy, right? It was ubiquitous. It's the same heresy that we're fighting today. It's the same heresy that early Christianity was fighting. It's the same heresy that sort of Romanity was crushing at some point, where Romans killed people for witchcraft, as a matter of fact. This is not necessarily witchcraft, but some aspects do actually overlap. We should make videos about witchcraft. We never really done that. It's a very often misunderstood topic. In any case, Alexius ordered the public trial and burning of the Bogomil leader Basil the physician in Constantinople around 1110. an event recorded in the Alexiad, as a matter of fact, of his daughter Anna Komnene, as a demonstration of imperial orthodoxy against dualist infiltration of the capital's elite circles, which seems also pretty, good result together with the other ones of Alexius that, as you know, essentially saved the empire at that point. The crucial catalyst for the Albigensian Crusade came on January the 14th, 1208, when the Cistercian legate Pierre de Castelnau was slain near Saint-Gilles by a squire linked to the household of Raymond VI of Toulouse. Pierre de Castelnau, a former archdeacon of Maguelone, elevated by Innocent III for his legal training and uncompromising orthodoxy, had been appointed by the Pope specifically to negotiate with the southern lords and to press for the expulsion of the heretics. Right. So to answer the previous question, these are not things that happen for no reason. Right. This is not something that you put into and negotiate as a condition. These things were definitely happening. We have sort of a wide, again, array of sources, including from former Cathars that had converted to Catholicism. Again, there is a lot to dig into it. The historiography is very interesting. But the most important message here is not the focus, oh, look, the church eventually exterminated these people. What really matters is to understand who, speaking in contemporary terms, who did these people vote for and for which reason? All right, that's what actually matters, because otherwise you don't even go at war with these things. You want to appreciate that actually other heterodox, not heretical groups such as the Valdensians, fully backed the papacy in the extermination of the Cathars. That in general, the establishment of Europe, both temporal and spiritual, was fully on board with the crusade, which tells you how suspicious, in fact, the behavior of the Occitanians really was. I mean, when the Templars were put under trial, many high lay and ecclesiastical figures deserted the trial. They said that was wrong. There were many different implications. This is a completely different situation, also in a moment of rampant success of Western civilization as a whole, right? I don't need, I think, to introduce Innocent III. If anything, we will spend a few words afterward. I will make probably an entire papal biography on him because, and also, of course, his pre-pontifical time, because it's single-handed one of the top most important people in the history of mankind. And if one does not know well, the political, social, but also military picture of the late 12th, the early 13th centuries, it's a bit difficult to even grasp why, right? Now, Castelnau's murder near the Abbey town of Saint-Gilles, it was a major pilgrimage center on the route to Compostela, by the way, whose abbey held the relics of the apostles' companion, Saint Gilles the Hermit, in fact, a 7th century figure whose cult attracted pilgrims from across Western Europe, and exercised extensive jurisdictional rights of justice and toll collection of the surrounding Rhone Delta, was widely regarded as the final proof of Raymond's complicity. Right? There was too much at stake politically, symbolically, spiritually, ecclesiastically. This is a video about warfare. I'm just giving you the bare minimum to understand what was going on and what was at stake here. Contemporary chroniclers noted that the legate had already fled the region once for fear of assassination, and that Raymond had publicly threatened him during the final confrontation, and Saint-Gilles heightening the papal conviction of complicity, even though no direct order was ever proven, at least. Saint-Gilles had been a focal point of Cluniac reform as well, as with of papal diplomacy since the 11th century, its abbots frequently serving as intermediaries between Rome and the counts of Toulouse. This was the equivalent of diplomatic see of some sort. Innocent III, elected 1198 at the age of 37 and determined to assert the plenitude of papal power over both spiritual and temporal affairs, promptly anathematized the count, released his subjects from their oaths fealty, and offered the same spiritual privileges enjoyed by the Crusaders in the East to anyone who would take arms against the heretics, and their protectors. Innocent had already launched the Fourth Crusade. With diversion to Constantinople in 1204, he had actually condemned, while still seeking to exploit its Latin Empire, was eventually established. Made a video about the capture of Constantinople, the campaign essentially of the Fourth Crusade, a couple of campaigns. The Pope was simultaneously engaged in a prolonged struggle with the Hohenstaufen emperors over the control of Sicily and the German throne, first supporting Otto of Brunswick against Philip of Swabia, before later shifting to the young Frederick II. All these measures were aiming at essentially reinforcing Latin Christendom, right? Backing also the Reconquista effort is very much connected. Before we talk Compostela, well, as you know, many of the most active preachers involved in countering the Cathar heresy came from Spain, also from Aragon. It was a country, as we'll see now, that actually supported in its royalty the county of Toulouse for old ties. This is nothing to do, but we're talking literally Saint Dominic, and the founder, in fact, of the first, the most important two Mendicant orders. I made a video about him, or at least about the Mendicant orders last week. We observed how indeed the removal of the Cathars allowed also for the blossoming of Western civilization. That this was happening. Las Navas happens under in the direction, the guidance of Innocent III. The Byzantine Empire is obliterated. There is a Latin patriarch in Constantinople at this point. So there is all an effort here to maintain not just a papal monarchy, but literally a Western Christendom together, and quite successfully so. I mean, the enormity of Innocent's achievements in holding the imperial Catholic tradition together, also quite well educating and sort of protecting the young Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, are unspeakable in impact, in scale, in range. It's something too big. Let's not even talk about his juridical production. Again, we really must absolutely make a video about Innocent III. And he viewed as such the Languedoc campaign as an essential extension of papal temporal authority as well, right? Through the lay advocates, right, the enforcers of Catholicism. His earlier letters to the southern bishops had already framed heresy, in fact, as a form of treason against both God and the Church, a legal innovation that allowed the confiscation of property without the traditional requirement of formal secular judgment, right? They needed still laymen to do this. We've seen this pretty well, the advocacy that was something slightly different, mostly preserving also ecclesiastical property, but as you see here, like the papacy and its legates have problems in Occitania. We've seen it in any case in the video about the Ministeriales and the German ecclesiastical principalities. The bull Vergentis Insanium of March the 25th, 1199, directed initially against the commune of Viterbo, had equated heresy with the crime of lèse-majesté, providing the legal framework for permanent alienation of heretical property to the Church or to Orthodox secular lords that would later underwrite the Crusade's territorial redistribution. Philip II of France, known as Augustus, for his systematic expansion of the royal domain through administrative reform and creation of bailies, sailor royal agents drawn from the lesser nobility, who enabled more efficient tax collection and judicial oversight. But truly called like this because he had a pretty high self-awareness of Caesaropapism, and he officiated the Mass, in fact, on before the greatest battle in terms of political fallout in the Middle Ages, that is Bouvines, like so properly taking on was a traditionally partial amount of spiritual power, and indeed the royals were recognized. I made an entire video about the Mount of Jupiter, the Saint Denis tradition, as far in this imperial lens. Well, Philip declined personal leadership, citing ongoing wars with England and the Holy Roman Empire, which was true as a whole, and asserting that only a feudal suzerain could lawfully confiscate fiefs, yet he eventually permitted his northern barons to participate after initially forbidding them. right? And there is some back and forth because indeed there is this commixtion. Again, there was already a Gallican sense of French autonomy as far as royal imperium was concerned. So Philip was a strong ruler. He was very busy fighting the Plantagenets and their Welf allies. They will win. In fact, the Battle of Bouvines also for Frederick II and the papacy. So he was very conscious, very self-aware as an emperor as well of his sort of indeed spiritual, not just temporal power, and wanted to avoid further infiltration of papal secular control, right, of direct temporal control in the south. Is just it would be interesting to make a video about the relations between Philip II and Innocent III, also from this ideological point of view. But indeed, he really grasped the enormous opportunity was presenting, right? Getting rid of the most unruly and fanatic barons of northern France that had earned through their own resistance a great deal of autonomy from the crown, as far especially as military service was owed. So he remained fighting in the north with mercenaries that he had put together with this quite carefully constructed administration throughout the generations of the Capetian monarchy, and sent all these incredibly violent and ambitious knights, noblemen, in the south, in Occitania, literally to destroy the Cathars, so contenting the papacy, and also maintaining his realm tidier, right? Both against heresy, rebels, really rationalizing resources. Bouvines is distant, but he's working at it, and so to say, for how it's going to manifest. Also pretty dangerously in that moment for his crown. You had between 1202 and 1205, after the fall of Chateau Gaillard, the conquest essentially of Normandy, Anjou, and Maine from John of England. The later victor Bouvines would secure the Capetian succession in northern France and neutralize the Anglo-Imperial coalition as well, allowing Philip to contemplate southern expansion in a more royally controlled fashion, which was very important for eventually reuniting these territories of the former Western Frankish, now properly French, under Philip II Augustus by formal titling kingdom, right, under his supervision, right. Innocent III was just more concerned about properly stemming the spread of heresy, which was not just about Occitania. It was, say, if the Occitanians could do this, right, they were giving an example for all heretics out there, and so they had to be crushed. There had to be a massive Christian response to this. The Battle of Bouvines later, because this thing, as we'll see now, as it's notorious, really would protract itself for a long time. Things would drag on throughout decades before the kings of France will fully take over Occitania and its wall, right? But it's true that as Philip was winning different campaigns, at this point, again, the first in 1204, essentially the outcome of what will be Bouvines had already been accomplished in terms of the expulsion of the Plantagenets from mainland France. Eventually, John returned, so that the Bouvines campaign, the final straw, had not yet arrived. But there was this window in which the French from the north could also further fuel the crusade under royal supervision. These strengthened Capetian finances proved useful precisely when the southern campaign required sustained northern investment. By midsummer 1209, a substantial force assembled near Lyon under the overall direction of the papal legate Arnaud Amaury, abbot of Citeaux since 1202, and later Archbishop of Narbonne, so again a pretty high prelate, a stern Cistercian reformer who had already conducted preaching tours in the south alongside Dominic of Guzman himself. So this figure gets villainized by pop culture in contemporary times because of the famous phrase we'll read later, but you should actually sort of understand who these people were before speaking. Were they came from, what they were doing for a living. If you're not familiar with the Cistercian reforms, it's a bit difficult, aside also from the mendicant orders that were being founded at this point, and their deeper meaning as the successful integration of the paparistic evangelical movement. So also the ones that had been potentially like a fertile community for heretical spread were successfully integrated in the Church of Rome, right? Really, as a massive civilizational achievement. I have some of my earliest videos dedicated to these topics, as a matter of fact. So if you don't understand the scale of this, if you don't understand the meaning of this, it's a bit complicated to understand also the Albigensian Crusade. Ecclesiastical history should be a must in school, right? You can't really understand much, practically like millennia of European history without understanding ecclesiastical policy, right? It's totally insane to even presume otherwise. According to sources that obviously exaggerate sometimes, especially if they were backing here the splendor of the expedition, the broader chivalric ideals behind this holy war and everything, the estimates of the expedition are 2,000 knights and 20,000 foot soldiers, right? It's perfectly consistent with the scale of a pretty big expedition at the time and in the place. The contemporary observers were all very sort of excited at these news. It was a huge deal historically. Also, just for the return of the French crown and the papal investment in Occitanian affairs in such an impacting way. By the way, many expeditionary forces departed after the customary 40 days of service, especially the knights who had been sent there without being too fully convinced of the crusade for different reasons, simply because they didn't want to fight in the south. It's a bit like, I don't know, the German vassals, especially northeastern Germany, that do not want to go fight against the Lombards in Italy, just because, in fact, the emperor has asked them to. And so this is the same problem we were saying before. Not even in northern France, the Capetian kings could simply force vassals beyond that 40 days that had been set as basically the gold standard for voluntary service, the prepaid feudal service through the beneficia. Obviously, some would remain also after that those days. Otherwise, there would have not really been a campaign to begin with. But many were also salaried, right? And or also, especially during this crusade, motivated by chances of pretty concrete chances of conquest, right? This was not very different in sort of line of principle, at least, what would happen after Las Navas in Spain. I made some campaign videos about the whole 13th century. As far as France was concerned, it was the big south that basically crumbles, is much more fragmented, is very rich. And here, everybody can grab practically whatever they want, as long as, of course, there is a more civilized order. It's not like also the here, yes, you're finding Cathars, but there are lots of Catholics there too. There were some Cathar bishoprics, for example. Overall, this was very different from Islamic Andalusia, but still the level of violence and devastation, as we'll see, were pretty intense, and it took some very different directions across the land, depending also on contingencies that we will illustrate now. Arnaud would become notorious for the reported order given at Béziers to kill everyone and leave the sorting of the faithful to God, a phrase recorded by Cesarius of Heisterbach, at least. This was a Cistercian monk writing at Heisterbach Abbey in the Rhineland as part of a large exemplar collection designed to illustrate divine providence. By the way, this was understood as a positive thing, as reflecting the legate's conviction that divine justice would distinguish the Orthodox. Later historians questioned whether the exact phrasing was uttered on the field. So if you're particularly fixated with this kind of with especially anti-Catholic propaganda, because you've been, of course, brainwashed from a truly obscurantistic lack of understanding, not just of sort of this history, but the role of Catholic civilization in general, which is incredibly common and widespread in many parts of the West. But just know that there's a phrase that he may have never uttered, right? It's not really easy to understand what was thought or said in early 13th century Occitania during a crusade. But even staying to the actual anecdote that, again, is understood as positive, as dreadful indeed, but still definitely done for the better, we should point out that here, interestingly enough, it's not even just like the Cathars were, say, a garrison and the rest of the people were there doing nothing, right? It would have not been possible to hold the town without its population, but it's properly the town that decides to resist the Crusader army and launches a sortie against that. And it's in retaliation for that the Crusades entered and massacred, right? And that, considering the laws of the time, just like what had happened in Jerusalem, right? Nobody could defend Jerusalem without the support of the population. That's why the Crusaders exterminated Muslims, Christians, Jews, and all that, because it was the people that had supported it. And it was completely normal in the military law of the time. It happened all the time, telling the truth. The West had, like in this case, actually, also during the First Crusade, the civilizational advancement to reflect on this in its own literature and its own historiography, and to explain how this was indeed caused by the vicissitudes of war. Like, again, this perfectly aligns with the fact that no government exists without the decisive majority of its population. So when you think about Gaza, when you think about Iran, when you think about any kind of or Russia or whatever, it's never the government only, right? The government is the people, right? There's no doubt about this. Just lesser people that think that, I don't know, they're governed by a dystopian regime and they have nothing to do with that, think that governments do not have anything to do with people's. Governments are fully the direct representation of the people, right? If a government is inferior, the people is inferior. And there is definitely not any mercy that should be showed, in my opinion. We decided to sort of distinguish in the military and the civilian that it's something done for the sake of sort of, especially in a much more civilized context in the history of mankind within Europe, in the old world that was fighting particular wars in a certain way against certain enemies, right? Certain aspects should be reconsidered, right? Indeed, if an enemy is able to control a urban space and is able to weaponize it and using civilians as shields, actually the Geneva Convention does allow, right, also in our world to fire as much as it's really needed. Then you can have a discussion on whether, necessary or not it really was under those strategic circumstances, but it's even contemplated in our international law today, right? So this is actually an incredibly important thing to bear in mind when looking at that episode. Was always I'd never heard of this, right, cited in a popular environment. There wasn't like some sort of hypocritical sort of accusation of hypocrisy to the church or some sort of bloodthirstiness or whatever. If you think so, you do not have the palest idea of how conventions of war really were, and you probably don't have much of an idea of also how the world is run politically and socially. Amaury, as we said before, knew well. It really worked side to side with Dominic of Guzman, the Castilian canon we had earlier debated. Cathars and Montpellier and Fangeau would later, in fact, found the order of preachers whose mendicant mission was explicitly designed to counter dualist preaching with orthodox itinerant teaching. His public disputations in the L'Orager had already demonstrated the limitations of purely intellectual confrontation, though. You can't just speak, right? Violence is definitely an option, prompting him to adopt a life of apostolic poverty that later shaped the Dominican rule approved by Honorius III, but also witness the massacre of the resistant Albigensians, by the way. Nobody really forced them to be the way they were, right? Wars are not fought, by the way, without this kind of recalcitrance, right? It's not like armies enter, as von Clausewitz explains, war is never an isolated act. Like, so armies are sort of at some point recruited to randomly invade a place without any broader context or motivation or confrontation, right? If this was fought over Catholicism, even at enough, there was much connected to the same doctrine in any meaningful political and social sense, right? A parallel contingent under Guy II of Auvergne, whose strategically important county controlled the upper reaches of the Loire and the approaches to the Massif Central, and the Archbishop of Bordeaux, simultaneously operated against heresy in Quercy and the Agenais, that is to say the border zone between Aquitaine and Languedoc, where river trade along the Garonne linked the Atlantic ports to the Mediterranean interior and had long facilitated the movement of both commercial goods and dualist missionaries. Raymond VI, born in 1156, count since 1194, seeking to shield his own domains and having failed to coordinate a joint defense with Raymond Roger Trencavel, performed public penance at Saint-Gilles on June the 18th, which also tells you how really unready to this expedition that he had caused and that had indeed come after repeated strains of disobedience and opposition to papal authority will result in, right? In this, for this, and also showing the goodwill of the church, especially considering the position of the count, that was nobility was complicated to simply put down, was not necessary, but this was a great proof of redemption, all right, and good disposition from the same side of the papacy, was temporarily restored to communion and joined the expedition even, right? So, there's not much to add about this, thereby rendering his lands immune from attack at the same time, right? He had earlier married Joan of England, sister of Richard the Lionheart and John. Her dowry had included the county of Quercy, temporarily binding English and Toulousian interests until her death in 1199. You understand also how, indeed, the English had been, the Plantagenets, say better. The Guyenne would be, as you know, the only part that would remain, in fact, connected with a British support, right, against the Kingdom of France. So this alignment speaks also of the broader international situation. Who was behind the Cathars as well? Who was backing at least like them as proxies against this greater Capetian papal project, also against the English Welf alliance? Raymond's court at Toulouse was renowned for its troubadour culture, figures such as Père Vidal and Raymond de Miraval, and relative tolerance of religious difference that allowed Cathar perfects to move openly among the nobility. Cistercian reformers denounced the courtly values celebrated in those songs as worldly vanity. As a matter of fact, we made some videos about the Dukes of Aquitaine's troubadouric tradition. We talk about the general archetype behind the Occitanian South, the dichotomy form and substance, the fact that indeed the Capetians had already been manifesting a quite continuous imperial identity ever since sort of the time of the Frankish arrival and sort of the taking over of the Roman Imperium. In the time of Clovis, with a south that was more Roman but also Gothic in nature and had maintained especially a deep contact with the Iberian Peninsula, as we will see better now, and also Islamic influences and so on. Some of the greatest Christian reformers, however, had emerged from these areas. If you think about the second Saint Benedict of Aniane, if you think about Gerbert of Aurillac, also Gerald of Aurillac is very interesting. Both have this Auvergnan, in fact, origin of the same place. The former was notoriously Pope Sylvester II, but in fact, always amidst this sort of perceivedly threatening south, this sensual, Chthonic, Pelasgian influences that were going against paternal, imperial form guided by the transfigured Virgin Mother and Daughter Church, as a matter of fact. The Crusaders at this point concentrated upon the Trencavel Viscounties of Béziers, Carcassonne, and Albi, whose young ruler Raymond Roger had refused, as we've seen, total submission, despite protesting his orthodoxy and attempting negotiation at Montpellier. The Trencavel family had ruled these three viscounties since the mid-11th century as vassals of both the Counts of Toulouse and the Kings of Aragon. Their capital, so to say, the main center at Carcassonne, possessed one of the most formidable double-walled citadels in Western Europe. Right? Today you can see, of course, the beautiful Carcassonne as a 19th century perfect medieval, or almost perfect medieval 19th century castle, thanks to the work of Viollet-le-Duc. And much was done, say, that can be considered debatable. We don't say, okay, well, let's not digress on this because we'll talk more about the reconstructed Middle Ages, but it's such a splendid site and such a massive fortress gives you an idea how powerful it would be also during the Middle Ages. Its inner enceinte dating to the Visigothic period, the 5th and 6th centuries, and substantially rebuilt under the Counts of Barcelona in the 11th century with advanced features such as rounded towers designed to deflect siege engines reinforced by successive counts with concentric defenses. This Catalan connection is crucial because, as we'll see now, there will be an actual military intervention from the south. Technically, Catalonia was at this point was under the Crown of Aragon, but it was part of the Western Frankish kingdom historically. All right, and there will be, in fact, later on during the 13th century, an actual French invasion to retake it. But Catalans can be considered Occitanians in a loose linguistic sense, and there had been always a great deal of social cultural proximity and interest. Right, it was very important for especially the Catalan merchants and the Aragonese rulers that profited of their Mediterranean trade, a great interest in maintaining a pretty fragmented, if you want, also decadent and fast lagging behind, as we were saying before, Occitanian South, to infiltrate themselves in those markets that were incredibly rich and that controlled, by the way, the French exports to the Mediterranean. So there was a lot at stake, and you can imagine what these wars were being fought. The Trencavel lineage in particular traced its ascent to Bernard Aton IV, who in the early 12th century had consolidated the same Béziers, Carcassonne, and Albi through inheritance and strategic marriages, creating a near-independent power block between Rhone and the Pyrenees. That's how heterogeneous and, let's say, alien almost, like this various vast and rich expanses of the Occitanian South really were also in the eyes of the more orderly and rapaciously imperially minded northerners of the Languedoc. The Crusader army reached Béziers on July the 21st, 1209. After the citizens, as we were saying before, declined to surrender the Cathars among them, an unplanned sortie was driven back through the open gates, and the town fell within hours and was subjected to indiscriminate slaughter, in which several thousand inhabitants perished, regardless of confession. Roughly one, and again, for the decisive moral majority we're talking about, we're talking roughly 1/10 of a population of about 10,000. Speaking the Cathars, of whom fewer than 3% were heretics, according to the local bishop, at least. The sudden collapse of the gates allowed the Crusader camp followers, the so-called ribaut, to pour into the streets ahead of the knights, turning the assault into an uncontrolled massacre that neither Arnaud Amaury nor the military leaders could restrain. As a matter of fact, this may have actually gone against the same indications of Arnaud Amaury, but it was also part of the time. And frankly, this ribaut, it's possible, very possible, some of them were heretics themselves. I mean, think about the Brabançons, think about all this kind of pretty ill-famed soldiery that was really scorching this enormous Gallic world, as mercenaries are desperate, as robbers, and that were, however, pretty efficient as far as maintaining the logistics of the army, as sort of skirmishers, as vanguards, and so on. This is exactly what happens, right? They are very unruly. They do not care, probably, about any, in fact, religious division. It would turn out likely that the massacre of Béziers may have also occurred without the actual will or command of the Crusader army leaders. All right. Béziers stood on a steep hill overlooking the Orbe River, whose valley formed a natural corridor linking the Mediterranean coast to the interior plateau, and was protected by Roman walls that had been repeatedly strengthened during the 12th century against Catalan and Aragonese pressure that, as we've seen, was already pushing from the south to expand further in Occitania. Its sudden fall sent a wave of terror through the remaining southern towns, whose consuls recognized that negotiated surrender offered the only hope of survival. The survivors of the garrison and population were dispersed, the city burned, and the Crusaders advanced unopposed to Carcassonne, arriving on August the 1st, after covering the intervening distance in 6 days. The overcrowded citadel, normally housing 3,000 to 4,000 but swollen with rural refugees at this point, lost its northern suburb and water sources after an assault on August the 3rd. A subsequent attack on the Castellar, the lower fortified suburb that controlled access to the main citadel's water supply drawn from the Aude River, whose seasonal flow and summer low water had already forced successive viscounts to develop cistern systems that proved inadequate under refugee pressure, was repulsed, right, prompting Raymond Roger to sortie, kill soldiers in the suburbs, and fire the buildings to deny them to the besiegers. Peter II of Aragon, suzerain of part of the Trencavel inheritance that we described before, and thus seeking to preserve his regional influence, had only recently returned from the great Christian victory at Las Navas de Tolosa in July 1212 against the Almohads, where he had commanded the left wing from the side of Aragon of the Christian line, and his personal charge contributed to the final collapse of the Almohad caliphs' forces. As you know, there was a fierce clash, especially toward the Almohad camp, even though it was the number raised that mostly did that. But there was a really massive effort, generally, fought together also with French crusaders, and most of them had actually left. But we know, in fact, of some that participated to the battle at that point, elevating, in any case, his prestige throughout Christendom. His earlier marriage to Marie of Montpellier had secured him the lordship of that city. So a figure that was actually a crusading Reconquista hero, right? And in theory, had to, as a European monarch, proper king, had to support, generally speaking, the Catholic cause, attempted mediation, but could not overcome the legate's insistence on unconditional surrender, right? Of Carcassonne. So the matter, as we've seen, was quite difficult for the Crown of Aragon because they were basically to lose massive assets in the north. That's also why the siege was still ongoing. These negotiations were quite frenetic. On August the 15th, Raymond Roger delivered himself as hostage in return for the lives of the inhabitants, who were expelled with only the clothes they wore. Right? The Viscount died in captivity on November the 10th at the age of 24 amid persistent but unproven suspicions of foul play. His early death left his infant son Raymond II under the guardianship of Northern Crusaders, held first at Carcassonne and later at the French court itself, and it effectively extinguished independent Trencavel rule for a generation, though the child's later attempts to recover the patrimony would continue until the 1240s. The long minority allowed Montfort to treat the Viscounties as fully disposable fiefs, with the principal northern leaders declining the vacant viscounties. Hervé IV of Donzy citing sufficient lands of his own, even the Duke of Burgundy and the Count of St. Paul likewise refusing. I discussed this in my video about 13th century Burgundian warfare, because again, the general involvement in these lands seemed to a degree unlawful to them, and or as sort of princes, they were thinking about the level of distraction here, what was entailed by the sort of the predatory acquisitions of these other houses, possessions, etc. There was some general caution, as also especially these expeditions really cost a lot, right? And simply having to reconstruct all the fiefs, having to maintain some loyalty, it was not necessarily within the strategic patrimonial horizons of the major houses there. They were happy of looting, of achieving glory, fame in battle. They definitely cared about the spiritual side of the story, but they were also skeptical the possibility to sort of getting themselves into, especially as sort of the more already committed French lords, into this Occitanian mess, right? Literally a collapsed country, as we'll see now. And a council of 2 bishops and 4 barons selected, for this reason, Simon de Montfort, who accepted only after insistence from Pierre de Vaux de Cernay and Arnaud Amaury himself, and on condition that the assembled nobles were to aid him if hard-pressed as well. Simon de Montfort was the lord, it was a minor aristocrat, right? So definitely the ones that were hungrier and saw more the opportunity for their background scale, so to say, compared to the great sort of Dukes of Burgundy. They were some of the by far most powerful and busy princes in Europe. Instead, he was a lord of a modest estate in the Ile-de-France, centered of, in fact, Montfort-l'Amaury, that had already taken part in the 4th Crusade, interestingly enough, where he refused to join the attack on Zara against papal prohibition, in fact. We've seen how the campaign from 1202 had unfolded, right? The Pope had not green-lighted the sack of the city. He excommunicated the Venetians, but also he did not excommunicate the entire crusade, because otherwise that could have not proceeded toward the Levant, right? And so if you study how the entirety of the 1204 campaign really went eventually, like, it was totally the Byzantines' fault about everything, right? Including the fact that the Crusaders literally took the city once and did not sack it, right? And were awaiting for, in fact, the emperor that they had installed to ship them, to supply them, to go over to the Holy Land. And it's at that point that the attack began. So actually, these stories are incredibly much more edifying than the usual, oh, look, Amaury killed everybody here, or the Crusaders were some barbarians that destroyed Constantinople for no reason. People have no idea, usually, about how things specifically went. That's why I'm making videos about this, for that matter, right? Besides, again, the fact that Simon de Montfort passes again for one of the most scrupulous leaders he is the leader at the end of the day of this vast systematic conquest of the South that created a massive dominion that, however, disgregated at his death, as you know, and as we will see if you're not aware of that, in front of the walls of Carcassonne much later. Is also showing some specific spiritual concerns, like not attacking fellow Catholics like the Croats of Zara, for example. This is an act of scrupulous obedience recorded by Geoffroy of Villehardouin. He had later continued to Syria, so he had actually and eventually not just stopped to the sack of Constantinople, but had gone over to the Levant. And this had earned him lasting favor with Innocent III, and a lasting alliance with the Cistercian network as well. So actually a pretty interesting figure, and not much of a brute as is normally depicted. He, however, did possess a reputation for personal austerity and ruthless military efficiency that would soon transform him into the dominant figure of the Southern War. Montfort's subsequent campaigns transformed a seasonal expedition into a permanent war of conquest. This is the big switch, right? The early expedition, as we've seen, was not fully committed, right? The northern nobility was not so interested in the South in the moment per se, right? But there were the smaller aristocrats that actually were, and that turned this into a hell of the actual conquest of Occitania from the side of the actual French. After the bulk of the 40-day contingent departed, as we were saying before, according to vassalitic practice, leaving Simon with fewer than 1,000 men by winter, he retained only a few hundred, apparently. He rapidly secured Castres, whose inhabitants offered homage. It lay, this town, at the junction of routes connecting the Montagne Noire, the Black Mountain, to the play of the Tarn. Fangeau, we mentioned it before, is a noted center of Cathar preaching, later associated with Saint Dominic of Guzman, who established a community of converted women there before the order's formal approval, famously enough. I also discussed this in my last video about the art, 13th century Christian art. Alzon as a central base, Albi, under the influence of its bishop Guillaume Père. These are Occitanian names. They're something very sort of mixed between the French, Spanish, Italian, right? So they're pronounced differently. And Albi here increased municipal autonomy as well, right? Praxin and several lesser lordships. This is also interesting because, as you know, we call it Albigensian Crusade due to the fact that this was apparently, in fact, one of the probably most Cathar districts ever. So the fact that the Crusaders put at this point their serious camp, like they base themselves there to assert their authority with iron fist, is actually quite punching from an ideological standpoint and a moral, strategic one. At the request of the abbot of Saint-Antonin, Simon took Mirepoix, granting it to his brother-in-law Guy de Lévis, who was founder of a lasting northern family in the Ariège, whose descendants continued to hold Mirepoix in the later Middle Ages as hereditary marshals of the faith, a title conferred by the papal legate to formalize the family's permanent military obligation to suppress residual dualism, in fact, in the upper Ariège valleys. The Lévis line intermarried with other Crusader families, creating a network of northern lordships that permanently altered the feudal map of the upper Ariège, destroyed a house of perfects, the perfecti established at Pamiers by the sister of the Count of Foix, and seized Saverdun. Local lords who had sworn fealty soon revolted. Junot de Pépieux invested Puiseurguier, massacred its 50 sergeants after promising safety, and later released the two captured knights only after blinding them and cutting off their ears and noses. Montfort retaliated at Bram by dragging oath-breaking lords at a horse's tail before hanging them and blinding and truncating the noses of the remainder, one of whom was left with a single eye to lead the mutilated back as a warning. Such mutilations were deliberate terror tactics modeled on the harsh customs already practiced in the wars of the Reconquista and the Eastern Crusades, right, recorded at the Siege of Lisbon in 1147 during the Third Crusade as well. This was actually pretty common across the Middle Ages in different ways, where the blinding of prisoners served both as punishment and as a visible demonstration of the consequences of resistance, but also, especially for leaders, like the loss of physical integrity that was considered, in fact, in a truly non-dualistic sense, in an incarnated sense, a proof of, in fact, damage of a reduced legitimacy to rule, right? So this figuration that was as a consequence of their moral and physical failure as well in combat in holy war. In June 1210, the men of Narbonne offered assistance against Minerve, where numerous perfects had taken refuge. Montfort invested the place and employed the great trebuchet known as Malvoisin, constructed under the direction of a northern siege engineer, the largest engine yet deployed in the southern campaign to destroy the covered way to the sole water source. This is very interesting, by the way, because we explained in other videos how these machinery were normally erected on the spot, like where some, especially the beams of trebuchets, would normally brought from somewhere else, because they were there was the most important element, like the frame could be created on the spot, just like the stones that were thrown could be cut on the spot, like some monarchies, like the English one, for example, apparently by the time of Edward the First, carefully had some depots of uniformly cut stones for trebuchet shot, etc. And what is interesting is also the giantism. There were lots of these war machines, siege throwing machines that were naturally here, as you see, aiming at destroying enemy infrastructure, to batter them and to keep pressure on the defenses as the besiegers crept ever closer, right? But the interesting aspect is that, of course, for this monster trebuchet, there were many other ones, smaller, other type of siege machinery and so on. And these battles were quite dynamic. We shall make more about siege warfare, because we ended up making very few, but the siege of Minerve is also one of the most fascinating, exactly because of this imposing military technology at play. The town, in fact, capitulated on July the 22nd. The soldiers, ordinary inhabitants, and those willing to abjure were spared, but approximately 140 perfects who refused were burned. Interestingly enough, by the way, right? So there was definitely something to that belief, as much as the willingness of the Crusaders to spare those who repented, right? Who abjured. Minerve sat, and that's why the siege is also famous, on this very interesting location on limestone peninsula between the gorges of the Cesse and the Briand. It was part of a wider limestone plateau whose caves and natural cisterns had long provided refuge for dualist communities. In fact, if you really mark on a map all of these castles and you take a tour of them, you realize that they are all located in very impervious terrain, and they are very difficult to access, right? And we know how effective a small garrison was when manning these fortifications, right? So these were grueling sieges, exactly because if you didn't clear these fortresses, you couldn't properly control these otherwise vast and rich territories in the valleys. Minerve in particular was almost impregnable until its water supply was cut as well. Montreal surrendered without resistance under the impression created by this success as well. Termes fell after a 4-month siege instead, beginning in August, despite sallies by Pierre-Roger de Cabaret and a temporary relief afforded by heavy rain that briefly replenished the garrison's water. These are somehow pretty hot places here in summer in Occitania. But the most important thing is that it's difficult to take water up, right? So you need incredibly sophisticated and radically advanced hydraulics and general technology to carry this out, right? We will make other examples how, for example, a metropolis like Siena could sort of rise over essentially a semi-arid country. It's incredibly fascinating in the heart of Tuscany. Now, the defenders ultimately abandoned the castle by night on November the 22nd. Termes was one of the last major strongholds of the Cabaret family in particular, whose mountain fortresses, including La Tour, perched on successive rocky spurs above the Orbiel Valley in the Corbière. It's a massive with sparse vegetation and limited access roads that historically favored defensive warfare, that had long served as places of refuge, in fact, for Cathar perfects, and were designed so that each could signal the next by fire banner, creating an integrated defensive system that delayed Montfort for nearly 2 years, right? This was admittedly a very common system. Like, apparently, during the age of barbarian invasions in Rome, they could know if some host had entered Italy in the north, like in the span of a day, just, through signal, smoke, if it was done really in time. So never underestimate pre-industrial communications. They were incredibly, pretty darn fast, right? Including human mobility, messengers, and so on. Here you also understand why the bigger northern crusaders actually had left, right? Because, these were, again, incredibly powerful princes. Why should they have lost a disproportionate amount of men, right? And general forces commitment for storming these small castles. If you see them, right, there are the ruins of that. There isn't. Fortunately, some of them were preserved exactly because they're so isolated, right? So strategically, it doesn't make any sense. Here, the forces of Simon de Montfort are very much driven by the fact that for them, for their individual extraction, these are still sort of pretty important places to seize, and or that they are, as we said, necessary to secure the more fertile lowlands. In early 1211, Peter II of Aragon, that had been watching horrified at the collapse of especially the Trencavel, organized a conference intended to negotiate peace again among Arnaud de Maury, Montfort, Raymond of Toulouse, and Raymond Roger of Foix, though the Count of Foix refused to attend. After several days, Montfort obtained formal confirmation of his viscountess from the king. At a subsequent meeting in Montpellier, the legates demanded that Raymond demilitarize his territories. Upon his refusal, he was immediately re-excommunicated, and summon his vassals. This shows that indeed there was also an infrastructure. There was, as we explained, Toulousan comital power that was willing to sort of go at war again, that was capable of levying forces, especially now that the war had really showed how, had really sort of inflated the general moral forces, the hatred against the Crusaders, this desire to maintain local autonomy was evidently evaporating. Montfort, reinforced by fresh contingents, first reduced the last Cabaret fortresses when Pierre Roger de Cabaret surrendered them and released the captive Bouchard de Marly. This was a close relative of Montfort and one of the few northern knights who remained loyal throughout the early lean years. His captivity having become a personal point of honor as well. Emery of Montreal, encouraged by Toulouse's resistance, then revolted and shut himself in Lavaux. Montfort arrived with a force of 5,000 under the Bishop of Toulouse, Fulk, formerly the celebrated troubadour Fulquet de Marseille, who had composed cansos for the courts of Aragon in Provence before a sudden conversion led him to abandon secular song and embrace the Cistercian life at Tournai. This tells you also how much moral tension, which is truly what we gather from the entire evangelic papiristic literature that in history in general that we have. Like, there was a real tension, a real problem, this contrast between wealth, power, money, the sensual southern world that is, however, without much of an order and in a sense of center and hierarchy and so on. Here, switching to a life of the spirit and signing eventually with the Crusaders, even though, again, he had been big, as a singer in Aragon and Provence. They were deeply tied, and also to the Languedoc, that is more concretely like this broader southwestern world and relatively overlapping with the Count of Toulouse. It was pretty big also, overall. His hostility, like Fulk's hostility to the southern nobility, was rooted in both religious zeal and personal experience of the aristocratic culture he now denounced as worldly vanity, as we've seen in Vaupo's The Count. Raymond appeared with his army, but withdrew after an interview. A German crusading column, 6,000, en route to the siege, which also shows you how there were many hungry and angry Germans that combined this, okay, let's go sack Occitania, but also those damned Catars, man, right, to the siege was annihilated, however, and Angers, by the Count of Foix and Giraud de Pepieux, only one man allegedly escaping, so these Teutons do not have it easy there. After 6 weeks of intensive bombardment, a mine opened a breach on May the 3rd. Emery and his knights were hanged for breach of homage. Dame Giraud, that was the sister of Emery and a known protector of Catars that had deep feministic vibes, whose household had offered, in fact, hospitality to itinerant perfects, her death becoming a symbol of the Crusade's severity toward female patrons of heresy. Consider that they weren't just the perfecti, they were the perfecte, right? This was essentially like as feminist as it gets for a Christian, allegedly Christian church. They had priestesses essentially. This tells you also the deep chthonic undertones of the materialistic, as we've seen, Forte State, or tendentially also communistic, whatever. New Age almost kind of vibe for medieval standards of the Catars. She was in fact stoned in a well, which was terrifying actually, and also in fact a stain on the Crusaders as well. It doesn't matter how culpable she really was. Here 300 to 400 perfects were burned, right? This was a hell of an example of one of the most, as we've seen, recalcitrant and violent hotbeds of resistance backed by the same rebellious count. This was a real problem. Lavaur's position on the Agour River made it a natural assembly point for forces moving toward the Albigeois and the Toulousain plain. With his viscounties secured, Montfort could contemplate operations against Toulouse itself. Right? The renewed excommunication authorized seizure of Raymond's goods by any who wished, so Montfort had full papal backing for this. He took Castelnaudary, occupied the Albigeois, and on June the 5th obtained, because also some possessions with the rise of the count, the new rise of Raymond have changed hands, right? And on June the 5th obtained the renunciation by Raymond II Trencavel of his father's fiefs. On June the 15th, accompanied by Thibaut of Bar, who brought a contingent from the Meuse Valley and represented the continuing interests of the Champagne-Lorraine nobility, motivated by both spiritual merit and the prospect of landed reward. I mean, not different from the Germans here when the French in general we mentioned. He routed a force attempting to bar the road at Montaudran and invested Toulouse, but recognizing the strength of its defenses, he raised the siege to ravage the county of Foix for 8 days in revenge for Montgé. Foix, with its fortified center controlling the upper Ariège Valley, had long served, as we've seen before already, as a sanctuary for dispossessed southern knights and Cathar refugees alike. There was a general commonality of intents, as it's evident enough. Returning to Carcassonne, Simon learned of Raymond's offensive preparations and established himself at Castelnaudary to block their route. Most Languedocian towns temporized. Bouchard de Marly arrived with a small relief column and convoy. It was attacked by the Count of Foix, whose Routier preferred plunder to combat, as we were expounding before. They weren't really that interested in the general picture, just like the laymen in this kind of circumstances, allowing a sortie by Montfort to disperse the attackers. Raymond abandoned the investment, yet Montfort could not exploit the success because of simultaneous revolts elsewhere. The Pope replaced bishops deemed too sympathetic, installing Arnaud Amaury at Narbonne in place of Berenger of Barcelona, accused of excessive leniency toward dualist communities, and Guy de Vaudesernay, uncle of the chronicler Pierre and a former abbot who had accompanied the crusade from its outset at Carcassonne, ensuring that the key episcopal sees remained under northern control. Pierre de Vaudesernay's chronicle, composed at the request of the papal legate, remains the most detailed contemporary narrative of the early campaigns, at least, and systematically presents Montfort as the instrument of divine justice as well. Massive reinforcements in 1212 enabled the conquest of northern Albigeois in spring and the Agenais in summer, including Moissac and Pen d'Agenais. Montfort then secured Muret, completing the encirclement of Toulouse, while an ally neutralized Comminges. During a relative lull, Montfort summoned his barons to Pamiers and promulgated the Statutes of Pamiers of December 1212, which introduced northern French customary law, regulated the rights of the church, established a framework for the permanent settlement of crusader families on confiscated lands, effectively creating a colonial society of northern knights bound by mutual defense obligations, required new settlers to maintain permanent garrisons, and fixed the division of booty according to rank, creating an institutional basis for long-term occupation that earlier seasonal crusades had lacked. Right? This was a prolonged war. This is a characteristic of the 13th century. The system is quickly expanding, as we've seen in the north as well, toward a professional way of war. Right? Fewer troops, but better committed, better paid, and that can somehow, so fewer troops by the general professionalism, right? That was an exceptionality. Like during the 13th century, knights and squires, for example, became almost the same thing in terms of combat capacity. There was a general uniformity. Armies actually increased in size, but again, they were more professional. This gives you a dimension of the explosion, literally of the explosion in growth of Western civilization, right? And so this war could have not been fought, if not by that long. We know that wars of conquest required this, especially in pre-industrial times, very long long series of campaigns to curb local resistance. Right? Naturally, Occitania was civilized enough not to need to turn into Vietnam. Like, it was understood how the general wind was not just in favor of the king and the papacy, but that, of course, there were plenty of opportunities here. Lots of Occitanians obviously sided with the Crusaders as well. Raymond, meanwhile, negotiated an alliance with Peter II, whose prestige after Las Navas, as we noticed before, allowed him to plead the southern cause at Rome. Not for much good, though. In fact, Innocent III did initially order a halt to operations against heretics on January the 15th, 1213, and instructed Montfort to restore certain lands. But after hearing contrary representations, he renewed authorization for the crusade while limiting indulgences largely to local participants as well. Right, so not to also inimitate too many Occitanians to the Church of Rome, to the Crusader cause, and eventually also showing that there was more than willingness from the locals, as we were just saying, to participate in the clearance of the Cathars, right, where it was supporting them. Peter of Aragon at this point feels, again, that the situation is practically almost completely out of hand, as far as was generally hoping, and therefore, formally taking 3 counts under his protection, crossed the Pyrenees, joined their forces, and invested Muret. You know that this turns out to be not just the location where a king will die, but also one of the most important battles in 13th century Europe, right? And essentially the honorary first in which a flank attack in the typical in-depth line deployment with a concealed reserve, etc., will be performed first by also these northern crusaders, and also the southerners were fine as well. Generally, yes, there were deep differences between the north and the south in so many ways, but also they were part of the same broader Western culture, and of course they had a lot in common also just in a broader Gallic sense. I don't need to digress too much. This is admittedly, again, a military history video. We'll surely make an episode about the Battle of Muret. You know what happened. We will repercur it now. This shows, again, the advancement, the pioneering of Western tactics that admittedly had actually nothing to do with any sort of Eastern influence, whatever. People insist on saying, oh no, these things, it's because, they learned it from the Turks and the Crusades, and there are also, if you look at the Battle of Tagliacozzo, famously enough, you have Varak de Valéry, that was, yet again, that's always the French pioneering this for a reason, as they were the most feudally advanced, also together with Italy, the greatest civilization at this point in the continent. But the truth is that these tactics had, first of all, always existed. At this point, they're better documented, the armies are bigger, the battles are more important, and feudal warfare is fully coming to its greatest, right? So these are not much flank attacks in the guise the Seljuks that are also we've seen in some videos would carry out. They were rather something much more surgical, much more tailored to the specifics of Western combat. All right, very timely attack to cut the line from the rear, from the flank, with even a small contingent, sometimes also, however, a larger one is also the case here. Essentially, Montfort arrived with an army whose cavalry numbered approximately 900, of whom 260 were knights, supported by 300 to 700 infantry left to hold the town, while Allied estimates ranged widely but consistently indicated substantial numerical superiority, including 2,000 to 4,000 cavalry and a large Toulousian militia. This was literally the King of Aragon having arrived in the theater. On September the 12th, the Crusaders formed 3 lines. The first was driven back, but Montfort outflanking the Allied horse. Peter II was killed in the fighting. Contemporary accounts differ. Some claim he was unhorsed and slain by a group of northern sergeants, others that he fell in single combat with a Crusader knight. And the coalition collapsed in disorder with heavy slaughter among the militia. Again, the battle is quite fascinating tactically wise. That was the Aragonese were lured by the gates, of Muret, and Montfort executed this large detour to fall on the flank, on the right flank of the Aragonese formation. Apparently, they were not even in the moment. It often happened during these times. Like even when armies were drawn up, there was a lot of waiting in between the engagement, the various battle lines of the assaults during sieges. They didn't even expect the French would carry out that maneuver, and they were surprised and cut down, right? The death of Peter II not only ended Aragonese intervention, but also precipitated a succession crisis in Aragon itself, since his heir James, later known as the Conqueror for his expansion into Valencia and the Balearics, made an entire video recently about Aragonese, 13th century Aragonese warfare, dedicating large part to this, but was still a child and a hostage of the Templars at Monzon, where he would be also raised under this very interesting monastic chivalric influence, leaving the kingdom under a regency, vulnerable to internal faction and unable to project power north of the Pyrenees for a generation, right? This was really, Muret was big, right? The king died, his forces collapsed, so it ushers in this moment of instability, and it's a greater loss for the entire also Albigensian cause, so to say. And so it's this extended Occitania gets sort of severely beaten. Foix, Narbonne, and Comminges fell to Montfort as a consequence. Vaux also began occupying provincial possessions of Toulouse, because the seigneury of the count extended at some point. If you look at also what the Catalans controlled in today's southern France, so many different ports, etc. In all this, there are the peasants, the Genoese around, and make more videos about that. But there was also this early, properly Catalan naval power projection that had, again, flourished in this greater ambiguity and the centralization of the southern cities. Now they were starting to fall gradually under the Crusaders and by extension the French crown. Raymond, however, secured English support and required further pacification campaigns. In April 1214, the Church imposed a provisional peace pending the decision of a general council, which the Southerners accepted while John of England, defeated at La Roche-aux-Moines and Bouvines, and facing the baronial revolt that produced the Magna Carta, proved unable to intervene to back their proxies in the south. John's simultaneous disasters in France and the loss of the Angevin continental possessions had already stripped him of the resources needed to project force into Languedoc. The charter extracted at Runnymede in June 1215 further constrained his capacity to raise funds or men for continental adventures, leaving him powerless to assist his former brother-in-law Raymond. A regional council at Montpellier in January 1215 provisionally assigned Raymond's lands to Montfort before referring the matter to the Pope, who on February the 4th granted the Marquisate of Provence to Guillaume de Beau, belonging to a provincial family that had long contested the Marquisate against both Toulouse and the emperors, Duchy of Narbonne to Arnaud Amaury, and the remainder to Montfort. It's interesting that the de Beau, the Mirepoix, etc., those will remain quite loyal Occitanian noble houses to the papacy, right? In later clashes also against the Holy Roman Emperor, like they fought in Italy and so on. And so there's very interesting reorganization of local seigneuries in favor, of course, of a Catholic rule. In all this, Prince Louis, the future Louis VIII, made a video biography on him, including also a video on the First Barons' War. So now to talk about John, I also made a video about William Marshall. If you're interested in what was happening across the channel at this point, please check that out. Already being prepared by his father for an eventual royal claim on the southern territories, traveled south to assert Capetian presence and mediate a dispute over Narbonne. This is very interesting because, again, no royal had showed up. And so now Louis Presence, he was known as the Lion, right? Did definitely emit this roar in a conquered land. Toulouse submitted and its fortifications were dismantled, by the way. Toulouse, again, was the cornerstone of the homonymous county. it was more than that. Historically, it was probably a deep cornerstone in between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean watershed. It had a massive strategic relevance, a deep legacy also of Gothic memory, of sort of more, in fact, as the diametrically opposite to the Ile-de-France, right? Also in a broader cultural, geographical sense. In all this, and I made a video about this very important ecclesiastical event, the Fourth Lateran Council of November 1215, attended by more than 400 bishops and convened by Innocent III as the culmination of his reforming program, confirmed Montfort as Count of Toulouse, Viscount of Carcassonne and Béziers, and Duke of Narbonne, while restoring the Marquisate of Provence to Raymond VII. It also issued a comprehensive definition of Orthodox faith and new canons against heresy that would shape inquisitorial procedure for centuries by requiring secular rulers to expel heretics under pain of excommunication. Canon 3 in particular mandated that bishops conduct annual visitations to detect heresy, and that princes who failed to act against it would themselves face deposition, establishing the legal foundation for the later Papal Inquisition. Montfort enforced the duchy against Amaury's opposition, by the way, received the homage of Toulouse on March the 7th, 1216, and did the homage to Philip II on April the 10th for his new domains. Resistance revived at once. Raymond VI based at Genoa at this point, and his son raised partisans among the Fedi, that were the dispossessed southern knights who had lost their lands to the Crusaders and who formed the backbone of continued guerrilla resistance, operating from mountain strongholds and relying on local networks of support. In May 1216, Raymond VII entered Beaucaire, whose custody had been contested between the archbishops of Arles and the counts of Toulouse. Its position on the Rhone made it a critical river crossing in a traditional point of friction between Provençal and Toulousain claims. As you know, the Rhone was the boundary between the Holy Roman Empire. Arles was in the Holy Roman Empire, Provence as well, and the rest, like within the Kingdom of France. It's also interesting that the Genoese were back in the Fedi because they were probably seeing the French infiltration in the moment in those markets in the Occitanian coastline, like as a problem, right? Raymond besieged the Montfortist garrison under Lambert de Limoux. Guy de Montfort marched to the relief, but was forced to invest the town when Raymond refused open battle. Simon arrived from Paris on June the 6th. Two assaults in July failed. A third on August the 15th gained a foothold on the walls, but was driven off by the townspeople. With the garrison starving, Montfort negotiated the evacuation of the castle on August the 24th in return for the defenders' lives. The reverse provoked unrest. Montfort hurried to Toulouse, extracted hostages, and imposed heavy indemnities that alienated the population. He married his second son Guy to Pétronille of Bigorre, bringing the strategically vital county that controlled the northern approaches to the Central Pyrenees and whose inheritance disputes had long drawn both Aragonese and Toulousain intervention, strengthening his hold, in fact, on all this territory, and campaigned against the Count of Valentinois in 1217 to secure the Middle Rhone corridor against possible imperial Provençal counter-moves, before learning that Raymond VI had re-entered Toulouse on September the 13th, prompting the city to thus revolt and rebuild its walls, even, which was the massive strategic blunder. Guy began the siege of the city on September the 22nd. It dragged on until June the 25th, 1218, when Simon was famously struck on the head by a stone from a siege engine, operated according to some accounts by the women of the city. So to stress, at least in these sources, the sort of infamy of being killed by this chthonic feminine world that he had dared to tame, that whereas a snake from the earth lashes out at him with this sort of behind the walls, which was considered, again, like also proof of cowardice. There is all a courtly, chivalric sort of ethos and strategy, etc. Here it shows also the grueling pace of the Occitanian Crusade. It was definitely marked by some important battles, but also brilliantly by all these incredibly sort of intense sieges. Southern chroniclers turned now obviously also the image of Simon's death in such a way into a symbol of civic resistance in Occitan memory. Simon died, right, but his blow. Omari VI. So this causes a major collapse, right? Of he had been really the soul of this whole enterprise, and you can argue throughout all these expeditions. Omari VI succeeded, but in fact lacked his father's combination of military talent and personal austerity as well. A true northern knight, Simon had been. Omari raised the siege 1 month after his father's death, on July the 25th, and withdrew to Carcassonne, while most southern barons reclaimed fiefs held by crusaders. This is where, again, it's starting to fall apart once again. The country is actually devastated, right? So as we will see, there's going to be this very long mechanism whereby the French crown manages to reconquer all this territory by essentially not even much of the intense military activity that we've seen up to this point. That kind of been enough, like to properly destructure a functional Occitan power. But still, after Simon's death, there is practically this collapse. The rapid disintegration of the Montfortian position after 1218 definitely demonstrated how much the earlier conquests had depended, again, on Simon's individual leadership rather than institutional systems. In a pretty heavy hand. Contemporary chroniclers noted that Omari's inability to maintain the loyalty of the northern settlers as well accelerated, because they wanted a real leader, right? They were still in this war zone. They had, as we've seen, also the most they were not particularly affluent people per se. They had come there exactly to create new lordships, at least that could be more remunerative their ones. They were relatively exposed. And this accelerated the recovery of local lordships across the Albigeois and Toulousain as well by their previous owners. Honorius III preached a new crusade early in 1218. Philip II, seeking to impose royal arbitration rather than from purely religious motives, sent Prince Louis south in 1219. Again, Louis joined Omari at the siege of Marmande, a commercial hub on the Garonne, whose destruction disrupted river trade between Bordeaux and Toulouse for several seasons, which fell in early June with the massacre of its population exclusive of the commander and knights, which were regarded more highly. You see how sort of this social divide was also felt. Like, there are many other instances in later history where essentially heretical views spread among the masses more. Right, the lower estates. This is really typical. It's just like in today's world. Like, there are lots of people that maybe even take sides in different directions, but they also they're also wrong, even when they are siding with the side that is not heterodox. Right. So here it's a war scenario. Once again, the massacre of the population is due to the fact that they had been capable of actually sustaining the siege, but knights, noblemen, it could be also often making leverage on the heretical movements. This happened in other instances, but not being heretic themselves. This is really typical. There is an interesting social divide in this perception of authority, of religion as well. The army reached Toulouse on June the 17th, but abandoned investment after 6 fruitless weeks on August the 1st, Louis returning north at this point. There really wasn't much to gather here, right? Omari's subsequent 8-month siege of Castelnaudary from July 1220 failed. By 1222, Raymond VII, succeeding his father on August the 2nd, a more adroit politician than his father, gradually rebuilt a coalition of southern lords while carefully avoiding open confrontation with the French crown, recognizing that survival now depended on negotiation rather than military victory. Because that's what they wanted, right? You know, gradually abandoning all this Qatar thing and trying to save the savable, right? As far as the previous establishment. In fact, by this point he had recovered nearly all lost territories, while Roger Bernard de Foix took Fanjeaux, Limoux, Puys, and Mirepoix. Philip II died on July 14, 1223, and Maurice, reduced to Carcassonne, Minerve, and Pen d'Agenais, left for Ile-de-France in January 1224 and formally ceded his rights to Louis VIII in February. The new king demanded extensive guarantees from the Pope, including spiritual leadership by the archbishops of Bourges, Reims, and Saintes, a 10-year truce with England, and clerical subsidies before committing himself. On June 3rd, 1224, Raymond VII, Roger Bernard de Foix, and Raymond II Trencavel swore before a conference of bishops to purge their lands of heresy and restore ecclesiastical property provided the Montfort sessions were annulled. Right? So you see what was the point at the end of the day. They had understood the lesson. They realized that Catholicism had brought nothing but destruction. They accepted to follow papal guidance at last. Right? Many of them, as you've seen, they had really been caught in the eye of the storm. They had taken a side also to defend the Toulousan establishment. Now they understood that in order to preserve their own power, they had to comply. Honorius accepted the terms on August the 25th, but Louis, unwilling to forgo annexation, induced the Pope to reverse course, because of course the French crown did not want things to come back as before. Obviously, the Occitanians had been heavily shattered, as we've seen, but the possibility now to seize the entirety of this region and to direct the appointment of local nobility and feudal nets, etc., was paramount for the Northern Crown. It was living also a moment of incredible power, could literally affirm its control in the south. The Council of Bourges in November 1225, in fact, re-excommunicated Raymond on January 28, 1226, for incomplete compliance, because obviously something could always be omitted. Louis took the cross on January 30th. His army, including Thomas of Savoy, reflecting the growing involvement of Alpine principalities in Capetian expansion south of the Loire, reached Lyon on May 28th and advanced down the Rhone, receiving submission from most towns whose delegations anticipated its arrival. Avignon alone refused entry on June 6th, fearing soldiery excesses. The siege began on June 10th. The general assault on August 8th was repulsed, with provisions exhausted. The city capitulated on September 9th, agreeing to pay 6,000 marks and demolish its walls. Avignon's resistance was motivated less by sympathy for dualism than by a determination to preserve communal liberties against both French and imperial claims. Its consuls had long negotiated a delicate balance between Capetian and Hohenstaufen influence at this point. If you're interested in the later Avignonese papacy, for that matter, how important this city really was, how strategic on this frontier, you can check that out. Thibaut of Champagne departed after completing his 40 days to the king's displeasure. So not much had changed. All this, Bouvines, the collapse of the Plantagenet Empire, Philip II, but, the 40 days of mobilization, that was like a gold standard, couldn't be really touched. Louis received the submission of Comminges, annexed the Trencavel viscounties, and watched the burgesses of Carcassonne expel Trencavel, who withdrew to Limoux with Roger Bernard to organize resistance once again. The king reinstalled Montfort's companions, appointed Humbert de Beaujeu. He was a seasoned royal captain who now exercised authority free from the constraints that had limited earlier legates, his commission reflecting the shift from crusading expedition to royal conquest. Humbert de Beaujeu was essentially governor and turned north through Auvergne, falling ill at Montpensier on the Allier River, on the traditional route linking the Loire Valley to the Massif Central. It's a very forested area, sea of mostly ecclesiastical, monastic lordship, so to say. There aren't really huge cities. He falls ill on October the 29th and dies on November the 8th. Raymond VII and his allies recovered ground during the ensuing winter. Beaujeu, operating with only 500 knights, yet invested with full royal authority, unconstrained by ecclesiastical directives, faced a renewed provincial council at Narbonne that reiterated the excommunications. Reinforced in summer 1227, it took La Bessette, defended by Olivier de Termes and Pont de Villeneuve. Its capture illuminated one of the last duelist refuges in the Lauragais plain between Carcassonne and Toulouse, and burned the perfects found there, among other things. Equilibrium persisted until summer 1228, when Beaujeu ravaged the Toulousian countryside for 3 months without Raymond offering battle. In November, Olivier de Termes, who later became a noted crusader in the Holy Land under Louis IX, by the way, it's very interesting to think, of course, that there were all these sort of different figures straddling the generations here of the French monarchy. This is happening in parallel to, we've seen it recently in the wars of the Second Lombard League with Frederick II. So it's interesting also how the world sort of changes page in the meanwhile, but Occitania remains engulfed into the struggle where, again, there wasn't much of a real capacity to restore, especially the previous order, right? But there was all this strife for sort of trying to grab this and that center and restore at least some minimal net that could sort of be successfully framed as an establishment within at this point, gradually hegemonizing Frankish kingdom, right? By the way, the fact that Olivier de Termes went over to Egypt together with Louis XI illustrates the complex loyalties that persisted among southern knights who could reconcile former resistance even with service to the Capetian monarchy during a crusade, right? So this is a lot of stuff, right? It shows you how complicated that all the various allegiances were. But in such a complicated situation, you understand that, of course, there is not much of a unitary power in the South. That this had been a great part of the reason why heresy could spread to begin with, and how all these troubles could have been averted. Also, in November, Olivier de Termes and Pont de Villeneuve submitted. This is, in fact, the moment that it started playing along. Gregory IX, elected in March 1227 and preoccupied with Frederick II, as we were just saying, as well as the difficulties of Blanche of Castile's regency, right? France has this very interesting moment. I actually, incidentally, have a video from the lottery extraction, in which we'll talk about Blanche of Castile's regency better. Sent the legate Romain de Saint-Ange, a papal notary elevated to the cardinalate, who brought the legal expertise that had characterized Gregory's earlier career as Ugolino of Ostia. These are, by the way, the French names in French historiography, but this is Romanus Bonaventura from Saint Ange is Saint Angel in Pescaria in Rome. It's an important see, but just for saying, it's also how much of these parts of Europe were entwined at this point. A conference at Meaux in March 1229 produced the Treaty of Paris on April the 12th. Raymond performed penance before Notre Dame, was confirmed as count for life, but betrothed his daughter Jeanne to Alphonse of Poitiers, younger brother of Louis IX. Dismantled Toulouse's defenses, undertook to combat heresy, pay a substantial indemnity, raised the walls of 30 other towns, and endowed the newly established University of Toulouse as a center, of course, of Orthodox learning. It will become, in fact, one of the most important in Europe, right? Together with others that were all perfectly aligned. This marriage also ensured that the County of Toulouse would ultimately pass to the Capetian domain upon the couple's death without heirs, completing the juridical absorption of the South. This starts paving the way for the full incorporation into the actual crown domain at large. Like, naturally, there were lots of other lordships, let's say, but this land is finally heading toward full absorption from the side of the Capetians. Roger Bernard de Foix submitted on June the 16th as Saint-Jean-de-Verge. Subsequent military episodes were limited here. In August 1240, Raymond Trencavel leading Fédy from Razé, Carcassé, and Fenouillède with Aragonese infantry, interestingly enough, overran de Razé by surprise, but delayed before Carcassonne, allowing the Seneschal Guillaume des Ormes to strengthen the defenses. The siege failed, and Trencavel shut himself in Montreal until the Counts of Toulouse and Foix negotiated an honorable withdrawal to Aragon. Raymond VII, reproached for failing to answer the Seneschal's summons, renewed his submission on March 12, 1241, and conducted a token siege of Montségur in July without assault. In 1242, the murder of inquisitors William Arnaud and Stephen of Saint-Thibéry at Avignonnet on May 28 by knights under Pierre Roger de Mirepoix signaled a broader rising once again. What you really want to see here is how recrudescent this clash was, how there wasn't much, all the injuries, the pain, all what had happened in previous generation here was continuously re-emerging, because of course from this chapter system it was already again difficult to control, decentralized, fragmented, etc. You couldn't quite have much unity. Here you have revolts even caused by people who want to loot and plunder. You have the counts that are ambiguous, and still you have a real further killing of prelates. So it's as if the Occitanans had really not earned much, or at least they were definitely very resentful for everything that had really happened, which also civilization is not really that great indicator for everybody involved. Raymond, supported by Trencavel, the Viscount of Narbonne and the Count of Foix, seized the Razé, Minervois, Albi, and Narbonne, while the French held Carcassonne and Béziers. The killing marked the most dramatic single act of resistance to the newly established Papal Inquisition, whose procedures of secret interrogation and reliance on denunciation had already begun to dismantle Cathar networks in the towns, by the way. There would have not been a need, right, hadn't Catharism been a thing, as a matter of fact. It's evident from this whole scenario that historians of religions should focus also a bit more on history of warfare, right? The fact that here, like, motivations alone would have sort of mirrored that fanatism, right? William Arnaud had been active in the Logaret since the late 1230s, compiling registers of depositions that provided the evidentiary basis, in fact, for later trials, and whose methods of systematic interrogation became the model for subsequent inquisitorial practice as well. And so also from this, you can't really say, oh, well, but, the Cathars didn't quite exist. This was sort of you can't debate, naturally, the nature of Catharism, how organized they were, how properly backed by the county they were, what kind of institutional and infrastructural space they had enjoyed prior. It's obvious that also the destruction of the Saint Cathars does not, in the full sort of intent of the church, you would understand that, like, bring properly no need to even think about that anymore. I mean, the church was capable of making even a damnatio memoria of the scandal that would happen at La Sorbonne with some heretical fringes within the Franciscan order. Why would they have left specific trace of the Cathars for us to see? It didn't properly match the theological, the ecumenic, the imperial vision that the church really had about these things. But of course, this also the inquisitory sources and the general effort that here's put up to properly chastise these people as far as their heresy had gone. Not really, because again, this was a war. There are many pretexts for which you can wage a war. Like the papacy never waged something like this within Europe, right? Especially just the genius of Innocent III is not, say, something, oh my God, this is all a scheme. The Cathars never existed, just wanted to seize this. But how? Well, this never happened in medieval Europe. Like, there were plenty of other scenarios. Like the Pope worked all the time to bring peace among Christians. Right, there was never, you could excommunicate one side or the other, in the sense, back one side or the other, but as long as there is somebody was wrong, somebody's right, and you have to settle the matter. If somebody doesn't answer, you got war with them. The papacy had been invaded itself by Otto of Brunswick. We've seen it before. So there is really a lot here that are in so many different moral, political, cultural terms, civilizational, historical, and and even military indicators tells us that, of course, Catholicism had been sown really in the deepest fabric of Occitanian society and spirituality and politics. So it was inextricably connected with it all. The aforementioned, here we're looking at these tail strikes from the rebels. The expected general insurrection failed to materialize, in fact. This also shows how exhausted, by way, yet other aspect. We've seen it very well in the regional historical series, like how all these various principalities eventually are taken over by France, sort of lose, aside from the Capetian control from the broader royal house, their own political autonomy. These had all been powerful principalities. I mean, the Count of Toulouse, for example, had been very involved in the Crusades. We'll talk more about this, because they really made, I made only one video about the Count of Toulouse per se. But it had also been a very destabilized place already. So there is also a reason why civilization regionally, like even nationally, Occitania eventually falls. So this is a very interesting story. There are some parallelisms in different countries with this, and if anything, we will think of tracing these parallelisms in standalone videos, but it's really relevant to understand here the war. After the Ninth victory at Taillebourg, that I made an entire video on, reconstructed on the basis of primary sources, where on July the 21st, the Count of Foix was first to defect, compelling Raymond to submit in January 1243. At this point, essentially, the Plantagenets under Henry III had been launching this invasion from Aquitaine. So in that context, for example, we didn't talk about the Cathars, but just knowing, because we were talking just about the battle in general and the English forces and the Aquitanian rebellion, but say, bear in mind that this is just a few decades after the heat, probably the eye of the storm in the south. So, of course, the Occitanians would normally rise in revolt and were at least dependent on this external support. But here with the French victory, the magnificent French victory at Taillebourg, Louis IX sort of subjugate these guys. In fact, the residual strongholds were reduced exactly at this point. Montségur, invested from May 1243 by the Seneschal Hugues de Arcis, and the Archbishop of Narbonne, surrendered on March the 16th, 1244, after 10 months. More than 200 perfects who refused abjuration were burned, though a few escaped the preceding night, carrying the community's treasure, which became the kernel of later legions, as a matter of fact. And the castle passed to Guy de Levis. The Pog of Montségur, a sheer limestone outcrop rising more than 1,000 meters above the surrounding valleys in the Ariège, it is really sort of the Montségur means safe mountain, right? So it gives you almost an archetypal idea of how properly perched on this rocks and difficult to reach. It was really they chose. It makes you wonder, even as you see this locations, how much work it had cost to erect a castle there. Something utterly insane from an engineering point of view. It tells you how overly traumatically, overly developed medieval engineering really was. Something utterly shocking, right? But the sense here is that, of course, that there is this escape eventually, very much like descending down here, the walls and all. And the fortress had allowed the dualist hierarchy under Bishop Bertrand Marty, elected bishop of the dualist church of Toulouse, in fact, around 1225, because this did exist. Again, we do know there were entire bishoprics that were run by the Cathars, to maintain the consolamentum right even under prolonged siege and inquisitorial pursuit. It's that the fall of Montségur effectively ended organized dualist resistance by eliminating the remaining perfects capable of administering the consolamentum. So you understand a full integration of what was an episcopal hierarchy, right? Caribus and the final refuges of the perfects fell in 1255. Because how late this was historically. With organized resistance thus extinguished, the county of Toulouse acceded to the crown upon the deaths of Alphonse and Jeanne in 1271, completing the military and political incorporation of the region. Because remember, they had sign that without heirs, this thing would go to the French crown. And so, aside from the vassals, like this was already by name of the French crown. Like it had been just negotiated in the way it had to pass more smoothly under Louis IX. It was evidently also very capable in so many different ways. I mean, consider the Solomon of 13th century Europe, the peak of French civilization, and more in the Middle Ages. But so it would be too long to weave the praises for Louis IX. And among the various things, he succeeded in incorporating this vast domain. It was also so crucial. Think about Aigues-Mortes and the various crusades in Mediterranean. The French crown finally has an outlet on the Mediterranean. But this land was by name, but say by right, as a matter of fact, internationally recognized as the Kingdom of France, right? So that all the previous story of how, of course, the South had this distance itself so much in so many different ways from the North is something worth many other videos. Therefore, it's sort of very difficult to summarize all this because, as you understand, here we follow the military history of it, the events step by step. We can't analyze this or that siege or battle because it's obviously more interesting. You can look at the places, the history of these centers, and so on. But what is really fascinating is also the sort of the long-term effect vision of this, rather than sort of the brutality, the destructions of the war that, as you understand, pretty intense. There's this major turning point for the Kingdom of France, really the definitive absorption of Toulouse into the royal domain, marking the end of the great southern principalities as independent political entities, the triumph of Capetian concentration over the older Occitan feudal order, whose coarse language and legal customs would thereafter be gradually subordinated to northern norms, right, including language. It will take really a very long time, but still, right, the French state is not very tender-hearted in general. This heat also brought the Agenais and Quercy under direct royal administration, permanently altering the fiscal and judicial map of southwestern France. So you have a sort of massive change in the geography, in the political geography of Europe, that is not merely a matter of sort of, it starts as a religious issue, and it was surely one, together with a political, territorial, etc., but it definitely brings, it works as the catalyst for a much more concrete, right, war of conquest in a way. And one could think about sort of the general outcome of the Crusades and how this sparks, as we were saying before, in the video that I made about the Mendicant orders, Mendicant art, and so on, how all this changes a real view of the world, right? It's difficult. Perhaps we should, it is more than 2 hours long. We should make many other videos looking at how the Crusade against the Cathars impacted the world. It's something that, considering the general ignorance in these topics, let's say, still somehow resonates in pop culture. Like, it's not excessively so. It's more like a European history. People probably don't really care in other circumstances. But say the idea of the brutality in particular today, we tended to acknowledge in many cases, but also to lead back to the actual mechanisms, the actual operations of the time, how this war was normally waged, and also debunking some of the notions that we normally associate with art, just, to mostly paint a negative picture of the church. This is basically what it is. Like, it's Protestant vibing sort of attitude towards, like, oh my God, this was like a genocide. Well, no, it wasn't a genocide. Like, they didn't even have the means to carry out a genocide at the time, let alone to for this reason want one. So the possibility of controlling this land was much more important than trying to kill anybody who was there or who was, in the sense, simply connected with a religious belief per se, right? Even that wouldn't be a genocide, especially if you manage to to lead much of these movements that, as we've seen, were much more complex than mere, okay, well, this is just like the church. These movements, by the way, these evangelic pauperistic ones, had existed from quite a long time, right? So there had been moments in which the church had been lenient enough. The fact that the tentacles of this heresy, that was the worst kind, by the way, in also the broader history of Catholicism, rather than just Christianity as a whole, but of Orthodoxy in that civilizational sense. I mean, is really properly entwined in the entire worldview that the local rulers of Occitania have regarding their role in Europe, their connection with the French crown, with the papacy, that it's impossible not to see how this, even if they hadn't believed in that, and they themselves continued likely to treat it as an heresy for what it was, it offered them the perfect leverage, especially among their own population, this possessed, sort of alienated, aggressive, fanatic fringes of the same, for defending their own status quo, right? This is, I think, really important in a deeper sense. It can't simply be eliminated, right? And I think, again, that this is a very interesting video because finally we get sort of the entire picture of the wall, and we can somehow reconcile this with lots of other information that you find here around these figures, the various houses, there's many names that recur also in later history. So we're going here to avoid any other consideration. Militarily speaking, this is a military history video. We can say that fundamentally, like the Albigensian Crusade witnesses some innovations. We see that they are in line with the general homogeneity of warfare at the time. Like in Western Europe, you have the French pioneering, as we said before, more complex flanking maneuvers, a longer sort of distance with broader coordination. So showing how feudal culture was really pretty high. Like this is fought in the same years of Bouvines, that, as we've seen, is also very innovative, very much the field of election for pretty sophisticated combined armed tactics that you see that continue, right? Also within the same units, flank attacks, preemptive attacks with lighter cavalry to disorder the enemy ranks. We haven't seen it here, but say these are the same men that fought there, right? We see a lot of siege warfare, right? Military engineering, trebuchet, like really, this is really an intensely also positional warfare by some extent. Overall, however, it's also a perfectly average type of war for the political goals, for the strategic objectives. So we're privileged to witness to it as actually a pretty big war that is, as you understand here, also mishandled. The crown enters the fray at some point to show that it's there, but still it's mostly these various crusaders, the legacy of Simon de Montfort, that manages to finally establish a pattern. The papacy is occupied with Frederick II, but manages to consolidate this regime. And so all in all, like Louis IX arrives on top of some of his accomplishments, including most notably a book in a military sense, to consolidate this whole enormous territory, enormously complicated territory, right? Occitania is enormous in this sense. It has many different type of people, of landscapes, of cultures. In fact, as we've seen, other Occitanians were perfectly fine with this crusade. And we will, if anything, I was thinking about this, we should talk much more about southern France, what will become southern France, as we've seen here, due to the sort of the complexity of the land, the fact that there is, for example, the entire part of Occitania that belongs to the Holy Roman Empire as well, that has some very notably important principalities. We made some videos about the Dauphiné, for example. We have to make more about Savoy. We haven't really made that much about Provence either. So it's a region fully to explore. I'm really glad that we're consolidating exactly this more blurred areas that we hadn't covered in prior videos. But let's say this is a basis for our History of Warfare series and very much connected with the general warfare of the era, right? We really need an Albigensian Crusade campaign video, strategy video. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.